In 2016, the United Nations signed a treaty to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. This is known as the Paris Agreement and pursues efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is often referred to as the 1.5 degree pathway. From rising sea levels to extreme rainfall and more powerful heat waves, the consequences of climate change can no longer be ignored, either by society or the fashion industry, which will see many impacts on its operations in the years ahead. In 2018, the fashion industry produced 2.1 billion tons of CO2. This represents 4% of global carbon emissions, an emission share larger than that of France, Germany, and the UK combined. Fashion needs to act on climate, and we need to change things fast. Because if we continue on our current path, we will miss our 2030 emissions targets by 50%, and this will accelerate global warming. So how does the fashion industry take on the challenge of massive CO2 reductions? Over the next 10 years, the fashion industry must intensify its efforts to cut CO2. In practice, that means embracing accelerated abatement to reduce annual emissions to around 1.1 billion tons, which is about half of today's figure. This sounds like a daunting task, but the good news is that 55% of these efforts will actually save money for the industry. In order to understand how we can reduce emissions, we need to understand the fashion value cycle. The fashion industry comprises a complex ecosystem of processes, products, and services, and this is what we define as a fashion value cycle. It encompasses material production, fabric preparation, wet processes, retail-related activities, garment usage, and end-of-use activities, such as recycling and circular business models. A diverse range of actors and intermediaries are part of this cycle, and all can play an active role in cutting greenhouse gas emissions and combating climate change. In fact, 60% of the accelerated abatement potential lies with suppliers and producers, 20% within brands and retailers' own operations, and 20% with customers. Everyone has a role to play. Manufacturers. Garment producers need to be fully committed to decarbonization programs to deliver accelerated abatement. For example, switching to renewable energy, making efficiency improvements in spinning, weaving, and knitting, and shifting to dry processing. However, producers will need support from brands to decarbonize. This is where 60% of abatement potential lies, so the industry needs to come together to make that happen through coordinated and collaborative approaches. Brands and retailers. Brands have direct control over their own operations, but also have significant influence across the value cycle. At the moment, every fifth piece of garment ends up as garbage, without ever being worn. So one of the most effective things that brands and retailers can do together is to ensure that overproduction of clothes is reduced. Customers. By making small changes to the way we treat our clothes, customers can substantially reduce carbon emissions in the use phase. Things like skipping 1 in 6 washing loads, washing half of loads at below 30 degrees Celsius, and substituting every 6 dryer usage with open-air drying can actually make a big impact. As well as adopting circular models, which could deliver 10% of accelerated abatement alone if 1 in 5 garments in 2030 are traded through circular models. Investors. 60% of this decarbonization requires some form of upfront investment. But fortunately, the positive link between environmental performance and financial performance means investors have a direct interest in creating incentives that promote change and enable fashion players to accelerate their efforts. Beyond 2030, even if accelerated abatement is achieved, the challenge gets tougher and the industry will need to decouple value growth from volume growth to stay on the 1.5 degree pathway. Only by daring to change, collaborate, and embrace new systems can we transform the industry and create prosperity for communities around the world. So, no matter where you are on the fashion value cycle, act today to safeguard our future. You can get the full story on how the fashion industry can fight climate change with more examples, facts, and inspiration in the McKinsey and Global Fashion Agenda Fashion on Climate report at globalfashionagenda.com/initiatives/fashion on climate.
Hello. Welcome to the Fashion on Climate CEO session. My name's Samata. I'm the CEO of Red Carpet Green Dress. We're a women-led organisation focused on bringing action and dialogue to the topic of sustainability. We'll be starting this session with an overview and a bit of an explainer about what you've just seen by McKinsey and the Global Fashion Agenda. And then we'll have a very interesting panel discussion, and I will introduce our fantastic panelists after this particular segment. So I wanted to kick off by introducing Karl-Hendrik Magnus, who leads up McKinsey's Global Apparel, Fashion and Luxury Group. He also heads up the EMEA retail operations practice. He's very passionate about building a more sustainable fashion industry, and he leads McKinsey's multi-year partnership with the Global Fashion Agenda, co-authoring the recently published report, Fashion on Climate. And we have Morten Lehmann, who is the Chief Sustainability Officer of the Global Fashion Agenda. He is an established expert in sustainability, and he leads the content team. So we have him and his team to thank for the Copenhagen Fashion Summit, in addition to core publications such as the Pulse of the Fashion Industry Report and the CEO Agenda. So thank you for being here. Morten, could you just share a little bit about what motivated you and what it took to do the research for the Fashion on Climate report?
Yes, thanks a lot, Samata. So what we do at Global Fashion Agenda is we really try to guide the industry and to mobilize the industry to take bold action. And to do that and to move the needle even further on sustainability, we formed this strategic partnership with McKinsey. And this report, the Fashion on Climate report, is the first joint publication we're doing. And what we've really set out to do with the report, and you just saw the explainer, is really to establish the big why. I mean, why is it we need to act now, seeing that we are 50% off the target in terms of being on the 1.5 degrees trajectory. But more importantly is that the report really establishes where we need to prioritize. I mean, there's so many things industry leaders can do on sustainability, but also on climate. So this report really establishes where do we prioritize, which are the key levers you need to pull for the maximum impact. And what it also does is actually calculating the cost of pulling these levers. But maybe, Karl-Hendrik, you can speak a bit more to what it took to do the report, and also the cost and the investments behind making sure that the industry actually stays on that 1.5 degrees pathway.
Thanks, Morten. That's an extremely important point in our view, that a lot of our clients are asking us which targets they should set, whether they should subscribe to science-based targets, and especially what the economics of the abatement are. I would argue there's a fair bit of uncertainty around those. And we wanted to establish something that's called the cost curve, actually a tool used by many industries since almost a decade, and so far missing in the fashion industry. What is the cost curve? It's a tool that understands for every lever that we have at hand, upstream, in the brand control, in the consumer influence, what is the abatement potential in CO2 reduction, and what are the economics for a given abatement? So what do we need to pay, or how much will we save if we are trying to abate a certain amount of CO2 equivalent? We're working with some of our clients on doing that on a company level, but we wanted to do that on an industry level because we feel it's a very important tool. And the good news is not everything costs money. So looking forward to the discussion and hope we can add some fact-based into this discussion with the report.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. And as they both so skillfully alluded to, this conversation is really to help us demystify this a little bit more, but also think about how our industry leaders are tackling this challenge. You know, personally, I'm very passionate about connecting the dots and helping people understand fashion's contribution to our climate change challenges. Greenhouse gases are emitted throughout the fashion value chain, from agriculture and production to transport of garments across the world. And so this understanding and this dialogue will hopefully help shift our industry in the right direction. So with no further ado, I'd also like to start by introducing our panelists. Also, just so you're aware, there is a space at the end for questions, so please do send these in. We want this to be a dynamic space. We believe there's no such thing as a silly question, so all are welcome. And in addition, if there is any kind of lack of clarity about any of the terminology used, I will explain it, or the panelists will further allude, so that there's no grey areas there. So starting with our first panelist, we have Joey Zwillinger, who is the co-founder and co-CEO of Allbirds. He is very passionate about making things from renewable resources, and that has led him to start Allbirds and begin tackling sustainability in the footwear industry. Before that, he spent 6 years in biotech, leading renewable chemical business solutions and developing and selling high-performance algae-based chemicals in various industries. So fascinating. He's also worked in advisory and investment roles at the likes of Deloitte Consulting and Goldman Sachs. We have Dee Poon, who is the managing director of brands and distribution at the Esquel Group, a global leading textile and apparel manufacturer. She's been actively involved in education and the arts, holding leadership roles in Harvard University's Asia Center and Hong Kong West Kowloon Cultural District Authority. So extremely unique perspective here as well. She was also selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. We also have Rakhil Hirdaramani, who is the director of the Hirdaramani Apparel Group. He is an experienced director with a demonstrated history in working in the fashion and apparel industry, with strong professional skills in garment manufacturing, apparel technologies, and international business development. So key insights here, which I'm very, very excited to unpack. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. I wanted to dive in with our first question. And this is kind of let's just crack this open and just start where we're at. And the first question I had is, why has the fashion industry, despite all the awareness that's out there, not yet managed to leave this negative emissions trajectory behind? And what impact do you guys believe that the COVID crisis has had on the situation? I'd like to start off with Rakhil, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Samata. I think it's been a lack of clarity in the industry. It's not been a one-size-fits-all. And brands are usually chasing the cheapest source of manufacture, whether it's fabric or production. And this leads to a conundrum, right? It's all about clarity and consistent benchmarking.
Okay, then. So thank you for that insight. I'd like to unpack that a little bit more, but I wanted to answer the same question to Dee Poon. Do you think you could share your thoughts on that? Why do you think we've not yet managed to leave this negative emissions trajectory behind? And how has this year and the COVID crisis impacted this?
I mean, I think, the reality is the fashion industry exists within a culture of consumerism and materialism. And especially, I remember reading the Ellen MacArthur Foundation report last year and watching the numbers of how often a garment is worn, the number of wears before it is discarded. And the rise of fast fashion, you start to sit there and think, well, if we're making more and more stuff, how are we going to do it with less and less? The textile and apparel industry is also one that's actually very, very fragmented, right? There's a lot of different players in it, and it's not just about one person saying this is what we're going to do, but it's trying to get a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different companies, and a lot of different countries involved and ready to make moves. So I think it's been a very, I think we all know that this is a problem at Esquel. We've been working on it very, very hard, and I hope to be able to talk about that a little bit later. But I think the thing about COVID is, if you ask me what changes with COVID, is two things. One is we realize that COVID and pandemics as such are a result of climate change and the changes that we've made to the environment. And I think that is a very high level wake up call to certain types of people. But moreover, I think these lockdowns that we've seen in so many different countries, where people now are sitting at home and they're reevaluating what they need to really be themselves and to lead a good life. And I think with that, we're going to see a real shift in consumer behavior that will really drive change in how much people want to buy and what they want to buy, not just in fashion, but across all services and goods.
Absolutely, well said. I think this has been such a game-changing year that, in fact, if things don't change after a year like this, when will they ever? Joey, I'd love to know your thoughts on this question as well. How has COVID impacted this situation we're in, and has it taken so long? Why are we still where we are?
Yeah, well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me today. I think the biggest thing that's been eye-opening, and I'm in San Francisco, and obviously that's shaped my perspective a bit, just seeing what's happening in the U.S. particularly, and I think the interconnectedness of our species as a human race has never been more clear. And if you can see that collective action is truly the only way that we're going to get out of the biggest messes that we face, I think the pandemic was a great lens into that. And I would hope that people have started to understand that climate change is equally, if not more, of a global challenge than what we're facing today from a public health perspective. And I think that's been shown in the data that I've been looking at also, which is quite encouraging. And if I look over, we started Allbirds 5 years ago, roughly. And in that time, I would say that consumers in the early days really wanted to have a great product. And it was nice if it was also sustainable. And I think what's happened in the last 5 years has been a dramatic shift in a way that has really surprised me, and how consumers are now making purchase decisions based on more than just your traditional features and benefits, and are really considering sustainability. And I just to the premise of the question, I'm not sure there was so much awareness. And I think the study that McKinsey's put out has lifted up the curtain a bit for people in the industry, at least. And I think that will translate to consumers. So while I think no one would doubt that we're in a bit of a dire situation and we need to act immediately, I do see some glimmers of hope here, and the way consumers are shifting, and what we're talking about at this conference, and the real work with real data behind the recommendations is quite encouraging.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I do agree with what you've said around consumers. And I personally link that to education. And I think we have access to information that we didn't necessarily have before, that we can digest and translate in a way that we weren't maybe capable of doing before. But you did touch on data there. And I think that's a very good segue to my next question, because we're a big fan of metrics and accountability. We need to know what we're measuring to understand whether we've moved in any direction at all. So the report does allude, and it does really confirm the importance of having specific targets and being able to be transparent about these and to track these targets. I'm keen to know a little bit more about how your respective organizations have been setting targets and what you need in order to set those specific commitments. I'd love to maybe start with you, Joey, if you don't mind, and then I'll jump over to Dee Poon.
Sure, yeah, that's it wasn't easy to do this in the way that we now do it. So it's taken us a bit of time, but we started when we launched our first product just to count the carbon emissions and understand the pollution, and just a fundamental view that businesses should be responsible for the pollution they create. And so in order to do that, we first had to count and understand what exactly our pollution was. And so we built a tool internally, and I think there's been developments now where people can access tools to get basic life cycle analysis of your product's carbon footprint from very beginning of the value chain all the way through to end use and disposal of the product. And I think that, so we started with that. Once we understood our impact, we were able to then, and we knew intuitively we were on the path to making a smaller footprint than the rest of the industry. We started to try to really reduce that dramatically, and have made a lot of changes as a result of just an understanding of where our products were. We went carbon neutral by utilizing a mix of reductions in our product footprint and then carbon offsets. That was, I think we did in early 2019.
Okay.
And now what we've done is we understand our entire footprint for the company. We label each product with the carbon footprint that we score for each of these. So what we're trying to do is add transparency for the consumer so that they can compare product within our portfolio and hopefully against other products in the industry, not just based on price or quality or style or other attributes that they think are good for what they're looking for from a product, but also based on its impact on the planet. And so once consumers are educated on that, now we can start to shape the way the industry is talking about it. And internally, then we need to drive that down. So we drive it down through financial incentives with our carbon offsets, so that we have a cost to each bit of pollution that we have as a company. We put it into our compensation. So we have specific targets that we tie executive compensation to. and reductions on an annual basis, and a whole bunch of other metrics such as how we decide to trade off cost of product. Perhaps that's sometimes an increase of our product cost if it's going to have a positive impact on the carbon score. We can make that trade-off objectively, and we think about that through an objective lens. And so we've made all of those changes inside the company to help bring that transparency and do that in a way that really is authentic and ties our fate to that of doing something better for the planet.
And that's very much looking at, and I think you already said this, but throughout the value cycle. So it's very much consumer focused, but obviously you're looking at your raw material inputs as well. And I think that is probably the only way that we can tackle this issue. It has to be a very thorough vetting of what we're putting out into the world. Dee Poon, I would love to hear your thoughts on this and how you've gone about looking at setting targets within your organizations, if there are specific things you need to be able to do that you may or may not have already.
So we started publishing our numbers in 2005. We do set targets in 3-year increments. And just to share, for 2019 to 2022, our goal is to reduce energy by 7.6% per unit across the organization and water by 6.4%. Now, these are the high level numbers that we give to every single person in the company. But obviously, we do measure at a much more detailed level for everything from nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, concentrations of flue gas and dust, COD in terms of discharge, and various other things. Now, it's actually quite difficult to measure because, the reason we use a blanket number is because to be able to get down to every single product just requires our latest factories actually do have a lot more measurement devices within along different machines, et cetera, But to be able to say like this Oxford shirt uses this much water, energy, etc. Honestly, it's so dependent on everything from order size, et cetera. So one of the hardest things for us in setting these targets is also not being 100% certain of what the product mix that will be coming into our factories will be over the coming years. So I think to be able to measure, you not only need the hardware, but you need the ability to understand the numbers. So we actually do have a lot of engineers, and we actually make the sustainability targets part of the GM's KPIs, but they're collated by a sustainability team at our head office. But yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like a really great thing to do, and I definitely think everybody should be doing it, but it wasn't easy to start, and we continue to find ways to improve these numbers every year, not just in terms of how we're doing, but the level of detail by which we're able to understand things so we can better optimize.
I think this is such an important answer because this is kind of the transparency we need when we talk about the challenges faced. And when you mentioned about kind of knowing what's to come or what that order mix might be in the future and the unpredictability of that, that's an important insight to understand why this might not be something that's always readily available to share. Not that the interest isn't there. Rakhil, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this briefly before we jump to the next question, because I know you're very much at the kind of upstream kind of garment production end of it as well. And I'd love to hear your lens on this.
Yeah, absolutely, Samata. So, we started our sustainability journey in 2007, and we built Sri Lanka's and Asia's first custom-built green factory in 2008. So, our focus as a contract manufacturer has been predominantly on energy efficiency and sustainability within the 4 walls that we operate in, which is, people, planet, and profit. And what we've realized is people are the heart of our workforce and our business. So that's our top priority. But having said that, last year we were able to announce that we were certified net zero as an apparel manufacturer here in Sri Lanka. That was done by installing evaporative cooling, solar power, offsetting some of our energy through wind power assets that we own as part of the Hirdaramani group. So the difficulty we've had in measuring our KPIs is we've done so much work prior to the introduction of science-based targets. We're already starting from a significant disadvantage when we try and make our commitments on further reductions. That doesn't mean we're not committed to reducing further. It's finding the tools, as Dee really mentioned. We need to retrofit our existing facilities with so much technology that changes on such a rapid basis. Right. It becomes a cost challenge,
right?
Which is something we're really debating and trying to figure out. The beautiful part is, it is becoming cheaper now. We've got amazing systems, by using the power of cloud computing that enables us to analyze this much quicker than ever before.
Yeah. I think, again, you've hit another really crucial nail on the head here, is that this needs investment, that we need to be seeing the business opportunities and investing in this so that you can do what you need to do. Let's move on to the next question, which is around pace, an area of contention for me within this industry, because I feel that we don't move at pace. And I think the year we've had demonstrates that when the onus is serious enough, we can be an extremely agile and fast-moving industry when lives are at risk, or God forbid, when profit losses seem to be an issue. So I have challenges with the pace at which our industry has moved, and we need to step into this space of accelerated abatement. We know that, but to be able to do that, we need genuine, non-competitive collaboration across the value cycle. And just for people who might have a lack of clarity about what we mean when we talk about the value cycle, we're talking about everything from raw material extraction, fabric preparation, garment production, across to transport, retail, and product use. So it's the entire chain. How do you see this as leaders within our industry? What does this willingness to collaborate at scale look like for you? And I'll give that over to Joey to start with.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I'd love to hear everyone else's perspective. I think looking at the cost abatement curve in the study, I think it's eye-opening. I mean, look, you see where the biggest impact can be made. It's in upstream production, and if you look at upstream production, kind of two buckets. One is the energy generation that's required, that Rakhil just mentioned, and that's a really critical component to what the life cycle of a product is. And the second is materials. And I would say that on the first one, the biggest driver by a mile is going to be, or kilometer, wherever you are, is going to be in policy change. And we need collective action to advocate for policy change, to drive generation of different kinds of power. And there's a lot of different levers that can be used. I think the United States is unfortunately a significant laggard in its contribution into this, and has the biggest opportunity to make change. And whatever the mechanism is, it needs to put a price on carbon that flows through to energy generation. So that's point number one that I do think has created a challenge for the industry at large, because it's very difficult to impact that. But materials is where I think we can all collectively make a big impact. So if you look at the very upstream of materials, this is typically, in a lot of cases, it's large chemical manufacturers. When you're talking about synthetic fabrics, which are a predominant use in the industry, we've tried to avoid those at Allbirds and use a bunch of natural materials. But really, the vast majority of the industry relies on synthetics from petroleum. And these producers are high capital intensity, huge facilities. And in order to, each one company is a drop in the bucket when it comes to the output of those chemicals, polyester, nylon, anything like that. When you have these large facilities, you need to come together in the industry and have collective cooperatives and say, we'll both come in, we'll all come in, we'll buy this, and we'll share kind of that cost, so that the manufacturer can actually invest in lower carbon intensity manufacturing practices and lower carbon intensity sources. So it's not just from petroleum, but it's also from my previous background, from something as crazy as algae, or something using green chemistry. There's a lot of technological solutions out there, but it does require a number of companies to come together, because any individual company, no matter how significant, is not big enough to move the industry. And to us, that's where the collective action can be struck. And I think there's great examples that have already been in play here that in the footwear industry, at least, where we've been a part of, that we'd love to share with people.
I absolutely hear you loudly, and I can see Rakhil nodding with great enthusiasm, to the point where I need to zing this over to you and get your thoughts on it. And just so you know, we've got kind of a little bit before we have the questions, another 15 minutes, and we will of course open this up to questions at the end. But Rakhil, you were too enthusiastic, so I wanted to know what you were thinking.
So Joey, you hit the nail on the head, right? It's all about open sourcing some of this manufacturing secrets, which a lot of brands and manufacturers see as their USP. I think it's a case of coming to the table, stop talking and take action. You know, we have a great story here in Sri Lanka where we worked with a third party where we collected bottles off the coast of Sri Lanka by school children, threw it in for closed loop recycling, converted it into yarn, and it turned into an A6 garment. But it's a great story, but it's at such small scale here in Sri Lanka that our customer turned around and said, why don't we open this up to every other brand and manufacturer? Because if you grow on your garment side, we'll grow on our recycling side. And that's what collaboration is all about. It's exposing our supply chain, radical transparency, and, you know, stop trying to use it as a competitive advantage.
Yes.
I just maybe one add to that. You know, I think that the very far upstream in that cycle, like if you think about the polymers that are used for nylon and polyester and that stuff, that's not where people get their competitive advantage from. It's what happens downstream of that. So what I would just encourage as an industry is focus very far upstream, and we can share. We've done this with like the midsole unit of our sneakers are all made from a sugarcane residue. And that's the very base material is not particularly proprietary. And so we've decided let's open source that innovation to everybody. What we do with that to make it sweet foam downstream of that is magic. And we're going to keep that to ourselves. But that doesn't mean that the impact of the climate from that base material can't be enormous by sharing that core material.
Brilliant. Well,
Samata,
yes.
Sorry, Samata, just one thing to add to that is, you know, Dee will probably back me up on this. If you see our 3D, I'm hoping, if you see our 3D development, it's gone through the roof during the COVID era. Yes. And what does that tell us? It forces us to be inventive only when there's a crisis. We've been advocating 3D since 2012. Where are all those samples today? We've been able to revolutionize, but it's taken a pandemic to force us into it. And if you look at waste and carbon, and even within the upstream apparel supply chain, just look at the sheer number of samples we make and how many of those are actually thrown into landfill or destroyed because they're proprietary.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the report makes a very great case about unpacking what those upstream operations are and how they are linked to our emissions. And we're aware that as much as 70% of emissions can be traced to upstream productions. We must make it clear, though, even though that's the percentage ratio, that doesn't mean that upstream producers are responsible for the weight of decarbonizing the value cycle. Far from it. It's just showing you the attributes. At the end of the day, if brands aren't requesting certain materials or aren't requesting certain processes, this is a dynamic conversation. It's not a one-way relationship. And so on that, I'm keen to know, Dee, if that kind of ratio split between where the emissions are traced, i.e. how heavily they lie in that upstream part of the product creation, did any element of that surprise you? And what do you think it will take to address that at scale?
I mean, so going back to what I mentioned at the beginning, the idea of how often, I think it's 15 times that we wear a garment. Correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody has the statistic off the top of my head. But, you know, the average times a garment is worn is so small that the idea that most of the carbon footprint, the emissions footprint, the water footprint of this product is upstream does not actually shock me. One thing, you know, I didn't mention very clearly is we are a vertically integrated textile and apparel manufacturer. What that means is we do everything in terms of cotton. We buy cotton. We also work very, very closely with farmers, helping them figure out how to do drip irrigation. We help them breed red-eyed bees, and that reduced pesticides by 20%. And we work all the way downstream until we ship that shirt. So we gin cotton, spin yarn, knit and weave fabric, we make buttons, we make poly bags, and then we make clothes. So we are very, very involved in this idea of like, what does this 70% number mean? And how do we deal with this? I would say, one thing that's missing is this idea of product. So Rakhil, he just spoke about recycled poly product. We actually have a product that we did last year that was around recycled cotton. And what I learned from it is that actually, if you're working with recycled cotton, and because of the way we did it, you actually recycle the dye as well.
Yes.
Basically 100% of the water footprint from cotton is in farming. And it's only 18% of the energy use. And so understanding really like what's using what and where, that's going to really make a big change. But then from there, now we have this product, we must collaborate with the brands, because exactly in the example earlier, if there's not a market for it, we can make every interesting and green product in the world. But again, consumers have to buy in, and they have to want this product, and they have to want it more than the dirtier product. I don't even know what to call it, than the dirtier product, sorry, for lack of a better term. So what we're really trying to say when we talk about collaboration and pacing is one of working with not only people upstream from us within our own organizations, but also with our partners in the brands to try to understand what consumers want. And then alongside that, though, also, two of our favorite words at Esquel are trust and respect. And predominantly, we normally push these two or use these two words when we describe how we work with each other inside our community. So an example of this is in 2017, we got rid of every single locked door. I mean, so in our offices, you used to have to call up admin if you wanted a new paper notebook and a new pen. In toilets, if you needed more toilet paper, again, you call admin. And in the fronts of every factory was a security guard who checked every single bag of every person walking in and out. And in 2017, we said, you know what? This is completely disrespectful, and it shows that we don't trust you. We're going to get rid of all of this. Now, what I've found in terms of sustainability and pushing sustainability targets in our industry is it's often done in a way that is rather disrespectful, and really one where you expect us, the upstream manufacturers, to not care or want a better future and a green future. And I think
May I just jump in there, because I think one of the points you've made is about, I think, the premise of this entire summit, it's redefining value. And that point that you've just made is how you value people, how you value organizations, and how you create an environment of value within those organizations. I wanted to jump to just one more question, because I would love the opportunity, and we have so many great questions in chat to give this to our audience. The last question I personally had that we pondered was this idea of what the future looks like. And, we've talked about how as part of a long-term vision, the industry has to aspire towards a full business transformation. We're not talking about business as usual. We can't go back to normal. Normal wasn't working. So what is that vision? What mindset do we need as an industry, as organizations, and as citizens to bridge this gap between goals and intentions and targets and action and reality? I'd start with you, Joey.
Sure. Yeah, I think what Dee was saying is I share the view quite significantly that it's got to start with the consumer. And I think, in my past background, I had a similar experience to Dee, where I was making low carbon intensity materials and selling them into brands. And I had a very frustrating experience because brands didn't know how to translate that into stories that resonated with consumers. I think consumers care more now than ever. If consumers are made aware of what the choices they're making and what that impact is on the planet, I think we can see some fundamental shift. And so, as a challenge to every brand, to start labeling with what your carbon impact is, your carbon pollution of every product, that will help educate consumers and start to really shift the dialogue. And from that very downstream, what the consumer wants, brands will follow, manufacturers will follow that, and hopefully even we can galvanize some policymakers to kind of follow where the momentum is and actually change all the energy generation. So I think that's where it's got to start. That's where the transformation has to be.
Excellent. Let's legislate. I'm all for that. Rakhil, could you have any perspectives on this kind of this future vision, how we bridge the gap between intention and action? Oh, Rakhil, I think we've lost your audio.
Signs of Zoom fatigue, right?
It's okay.
I think the first piece is, just stop talking and take action. It's about committing and actually leading from the front. I think we've seen this on the front end development side, where we offer sustainable solutions, as Dee mentioned, and they sit on somebody's desk for weeks, months, or even seasons in some cases. It's about working together around the table and bringing that fragmented supply chain into a single dialogue, because as a manufacturer, we cannot do it alone. As a brand, they can't do it alone. It's about openness, transparency, and collaboration. And I think the touch point there is we now have the technology in place to ensure that traceability is possible.
Yes.
And that's the exciting thing.
Okay. Briefly, Dee, can I get your answer on that? And I'd love to send it out to questions because we have a few and I want to make sure some of these get asked.
No, I mean, I actually very much agree, but I think, again, we need to engage and educate everybody. Yes. So for us, that is our upstream partners, our suppliers, our even, our customers, as well as every single person on our production floor. I don't think that this is going to happen just from consumers saying we want green products. Even though there's transparency, it's too easy to greenwash. It is too complicated of a question to try to drive from a consumer perspective. But really, if we get everybody involved from every part of the supply chain and the consumer side, I think, things will pick up.
Excellent. So we've got 3 or 4 minutes to go and we've got great questions. So I'm going to have to dive into some of these. One of the questions is, how can we ensure, and I think this is a fantastic question, how can we ensure that carbon emissions are calculated in the same way across all fashion brands? And I think that consistency of messaging is important. Who would like to grab that one? Just let me know who would like to answer that, or I'll single you out.
I'll take a quick stab, just really quickly. It's very important. I think there are great standards. I think the SAC and the Higg Index provide some great tools that are not always accessible to the smallest of brands, but I think will be more so in the future. There's a great product out there called Duckonomy, which gives you an ability as a small brand to score your life cycle analysis from soup to nuts for everything you're doing. So, and then I think there's hopefully we're setting a great example on how to label and provide accountability in the same way across each aspects of carbon intensity of a product. So I'd say there's a lot of good examples out there now that actually provide the tools.
Okay, wonderful. Another question, if 20% of the 100 billion garments produced annually ends up in landfill, we need a moment to just appreciate that statistic, without being used, is it possible to use sales data to avoid overproduction? I'd love to know what you think. Dee Poon, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it does. I think, with COVID, with the very challenging environment in the sales market, I think supply chains are getting faster and much more reactive. I don't think that sales data will get us to zero, though. And I don't think we'll be hitting one-piece manufacturing so that we're producing on demand. Yeah. But I do think the use of information can help in that problem.
Okay, I do also want to remind people that you can download the report that we're discussing on globalfashionagenda.com. So it's a really crucial piece of reading. I wanted to direct a question towards Karl-Hendrik as well, who's still with us in the chat and has so much insight on the subject. We'd mentioned about kind of that vision, the future vision for bridging intention and actuality. Do you have any thoughts to add in on that before we wrap up this session?
One closing thought on, we discussed a lot what needs to happen in the years to come around collaboration. I think to raise the level of urgency even further, if we look out even beyond 2030, there's actually no way to stay on this path that we have signed up to 1.5 degree global warming unless we move to a much more circular economy and much more recycled materials inflow. So everything that was said is further rising, even if we basically pull all the known levers to mankind. If we want to stay on this pathway beyond 2030, we need to move to a significantly higher share of circularity in the industry and recycling in the industry. Otherwise, it's just mathematically not possible. So I think that's the sheer truth that we need to confront ourselves with. And I think a lot of the thoughts mentioned today are at least a great pathway into that.
Thank you so much, Karl, Dee Poon, Rakhil, Joey, and obviously the Global Fashion Agenda. Please do look at the report, which is on globalfashionagenda.com. We've run out of time, but thank you for your expertise. Thank you for your insight and knowledge. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.